Welcome once again to Raising Questions. We are now in a place in history that's really pretty amazing. The American national elections have taken place, and nobody knows who is going to be the next president, at least as of tonight. It all took place about 2 days ago. And we are wondering about several things in this country. And I thought I'd throw my hat in the ring and tell you that in the first place, anybody who knows what's going to happen, who's going to be the next president, or for that matter, what his presidency is going to be like, or her presidency, anybody who talks about that with any certainty whatsoever is badly informed. But I'll try my best. I think there are three conflicts that have been revealed or even elucidated by the national mess that we've gotten ourselves into. The mess being this undecided election and the electoral process itself. I'd like to talk about the Constitution and its promise to promote the general welfare in the first place, and a conflict that comes out of that, and then the equal protection of the laws, which comes out of that also. So that's the second conflict. And the third conflict would be our national situation as of election day versus the situation before that day. There was a conflict there, and boy, has it launched us into a mess, the solution for that conflict, that is. So hopefully that's not too vague. Again, we're doing the Constitution and its promise of the general welfare. That's the first conflict that I see. The general welfare, to promote the general welfare, is a purpose, one of the main purposes of the Constitution. It even says so, right in the preamble to the Constitution. There is the promise that the Constitution will try to promote the general welfare. Nobody can define that, but we all sort of have an internal and an intuitive idea of what that is, just to make things good, make things even better. That's what the Constitution is there for. And so it set up a government. Unfortunately, here's the conflict. We're going to promote the general welfare, said the Constitution, and at the same time, it did something that unpromotes the general welfare, at least in the opinion of many people. Namely, it set up a government not truly capable of acting with one voice to promote the general welfare. It set up a government with the famous separation of powers. So we have a president, a Congress, and a Supreme Court. President, executive, Congress, legislative, Supreme Court, judicial. And they conflict with each other on purpose. The founding fathers, or the founders, if you want to be new age, the founding fathers said, what we want to do in the Constitution is to use the ambition of the people making up the legislature against the ambition of the people making up the Supreme Court, against the ambition of whoever's in the White House. In other words, on purpose, conflict was built into the Constitution. The legislature does one thing, makes laws. The judicial, the Supreme Court, checks the laws against the Constitution. And the other guy in the White House executes the laws, does what the legislature says, and also has some powers on his own that he doesn't have to ask anybody about. But at any time, the Supreme Court can step in and say, wait a minute, those powers are good and they're big and they're necessary, but you went too far. So there's conflict built into the very system, which is an almost unfortunate thing. And on top of that, besides that gridlock that we get into, on top of that, the American people, many of them at least, many millions of Americans have ancestors who fled screaming in panic from government, from the German government, British government, this, that, and the Macedonian government. All sorts of governments were fled from by the very people, well, the ancestors of the people who live here now, and by many millions of the people who live here now, as a matter of fact. They fled from government. So it's in our genes, more or less, that when we read the preamble to our Constitution, that the government is here to promote the general welfare, we say, oh, sure, forget it. That's not going to happen, because some tyrannical prince or king or dictator somewhere else years ago terrorized our ancestors or terrorized those of us who are new to the country and who fled from a government. So it's in our DNA and in our history. We don't like government all that much. So the preamble to the Constitution and its promise to promote the general welfare through government kind of falls on deaf ears, or worse, as a matter of fact. And on top of that, because so many millions of us had an antipathy to government in general, many millions of us woke up in the morning and said, well, I don't want the government's help to do this, that, and the other thing. I'm going to do it myself. So what is in our DNA, what got passed down to us, is personal initiative, private sector, laissez-faire, let the economy do what it wants, that kind of thing. In Europe, exactly the opposite mentality is what's so strong, and not just in Europe. In Europe, strong governments do promote the general welfare, and there's less activity and initiative on the part of the citizens. However, there's a very strong democracy in places like Germany, so they can check the government that way. They don't have governments that are internally divided with a division of powers the way the American government is divided. So what? Why mention that today? Again, we just had an election, and we don't know who's going to be controlling the Supreme Court or the legislature or the president. We do know who's in the majority of the Supreme Court, but we don't really know how they are going to act. Who really controls the people on the Supreme Court? There is some control exercised by the Chief Justice, and then there's personal control on the part of the justices. In other words, it's unpredictable. It's not just one mass, one body that says, we are going to do this. There's a division of power there too. And we don't know who's going to straighten out the mess. It is conceivable that neither candidate, major candidate, is going to become president on their own by winning the Electoral College. And even if that's wrong, it's an interesting question. What happens? What happens is the House of Representatives chooses the president, the Senate chooses the vice president, and there's all sorts of party politics involved there. The House of Representatives is, of course, Democratic. We all know that. The majority of the House of Representatives are Democrats. However, the Constitution says individuals in the House of Representatives do not vote individually for president. They get together and they're lumped together by states. So whoever controls the majority of states is likely to vote in a particular way for the new president. And in the Senate, again, party politics definitely will play a role. So we have more and more division and unpredictability. In other countries, you have nothing like this whatsoever. So we're in kind of a mess compared to the way that other countries handle a similar situation. Well, conflict number two. What about equal protection, which is part of the Constitution, and due process of the laws? Basically, that means if there's a law, it has to apply to everybody equally. And there are many, many complications involved there. There are many, many people in cars right at this very instant who do not even have a driver's license. It's amazing. A lot of people fly in the face of the general requirement that if you're in a car, you got to have a driver's license. Why? Because they're passengers and they never drive. Also because they're children who can't drive anyway. In other words, the laws don't say everybody has to have a driver's license. The laws say if you want to drive a car, then you have to have a driver's license. So equality doesn't mean that a law is actually applied the same way to everyone at all times. If you're 8 years old, it will apply to you later on, the driver's licensing laws, but it won't right now. So in other words, it's a delicate question. What does that mean, the equal protection of the laws? Well, one thing that it should mean is that when you vote for president, you ought to be able to have the same power, the same vote, as anybody else. And the Republicans, especially this time around, are saying that's not taking place. So there seems to be a big possible conflict between the constitutional notion of equal protection of the laws, fairness of the laws, and what actually happened on election day. Maybe rules were violated. Who knows? So there's a conflict. Third thing, another conflict. What conflict? Conflict. These things are so complicated, I stumble all over them. The third conflict is the national situation on election day and the national situation before that national election day. I see a real conflict there, and the way that it applies to the way that the election was carried out. And I like to make this medical metaphor. Let's say you go to the doctor and you say, "Doctor, I really need help. I have a broken arm." And the doctor says, "It's very interesting. How's your arm been over the past couple of months?" "Well, actually real good, very healthy, etc. I'm into weightlifting, baseball, football, all sorts of stuff, no problems whatsoever." What if the doctor said, "Okay, let's choose a day in the past couple of months, and again, how was your arm?" "Just fine." "Well, then," says the doctor, "I vote for that. You have a healthy arm, and it looks to me like we don't need to do anything at all. Goodbye and good luck." You don't want that. You want the doctor to say, "What is the situation today? What is it right now?" And we'll make a diagnosis and we'll get a prescription based on what's happening now. In our recent election of just a couple of days ago, well, it should have been, I think, a couple of days ago. It wasn't. It took place over weeks, probably months, as a matter of fact. And zillions of people voted, to use the scientific term, zillions of people voted for president when the national situation was different than it was on election day. It was different in a million different ways. Just think of a way that it could be different, and it was. The economy, the virus to some extent, and so forth, and especially the picture or the image of the president was different on election day in people's minds than it was during the past couple of months. I would say in zillions of cases that was true. Just one tiny example, for instance. In the first debate, the president came on like a boxer, which is okay, except that he wasn't following the rules. There were a lot of kidney punches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and he ignored the referee. He actually started beating up the referee. We all know that. That took place way before the election, and I wonder, the show is called Raising Questions, I'm just raising the question, did people make up their minds weeks ago based on an image of the president that was valid weeks ago? And I wonder if they changed their mind after they filled out an absentee ballot and took it by to wherever to get it counted. I wonder how much that affected things. Again, going back to that medical metaphor. My arm's been fine for two months, but right now I've got a problem. In other words, the situation, doctor, is different today than it has been over the past 2 months. Please make a diagnosis and write a prescription based on what's happening now. Normally, that's what happens on election day. People go in early November to the polls, and they don't say, "Gee, what was the situation a couple months ago? Does anybody know?" They don't do that. They know the situation as of that day. And I wonder to what extent there's a giant conflict there. In other words, the situation on election day and the situation over the previous couple of months, that may have made a difference. That may have made a giant difference. And we can introduce here, again, conflict number 2, back into what I was talking about. Is that really the fair application of the law? In other words, if I filled out an absentee ballot a couple of months ago and I take it by and it's put into a huge bin and I change my mind, do I have the same equality, the same equal protection of the laws as somebody who votes on the day of the election instead of making out an absentee ballot? That's got a lot of complications to it. It's pretty unclear, but I really wonder how far these conflicts go, and especially that conflict between the situation on the national election day and the situation leading up to it. So there are 3 conflicts, and we mention all of that. I mention all of that. Why? because nobody knows who's going to be in charge of the White House. We're still unsure about the Senate. The House of Representatives looks pretty clear. Looks like one party is going to keep its majority, but the minority seems to have increased, and the question is, what kind of influence will they have? So we don't know what's going to be happening, and these three conflicts will have played quite a gigantic role. And there are observers, and I'm one of them, who say we're not in really a very new situation. If the current president is replaced in January, I think we still have the same situation that we've had for a very, very long time. A divided government, a divided population, and a lot of unclarity about equal protection of the laws and other parts of the Constitution, all coming back to the idea, how could the Constitution and how could the government in America promote the general welfare with all of these internal conflicts that weaken it? Who's actually the strongest influence on the American population, economy, on the American mind? And I'm not the only one, thank goodness. I point out that the people in Silicon Valley are now pretty much guaranteed that they will have the same power they have had as they now have and as they've had recently. Divided government will be unable to check them. And also, divided government will not check the economic kings and queens on Wall Street. And it's those two private centers of power that are probably going to have far more power, far more influence over the American mind and way of life than the government. I'm raising the question, isn't that a problem? Well, we'll see. Next time, we'll solve that and all other problems.